Yeah, my knowledge about finance and in particular how to raise funds professionally was very limited. I had as a co-founder Professor Melchers, the former director of the Basel Institute for Immunology. And he, of course, had a lot of scientific credibility in the field and was also known to many investors who I approached in the early days. I mean, we bumped into people that we knew from our academic career who had moved into the finance industry or into the venture capital industry. I had two or three contacts. Professor Melchers had a few more contacts. Some of the contacts that we had were the same ones at the same venture capital companies. And therefore, when we approached, when I approached my friends and Professor Melchers approached his friends, it all came together at the same venture fund. And this was kind of the first door opener where the venture capital funds really took a closer look at our project. I think it's rather unlikely that you get traction with a venture fund if you simply submit a business plan to either their contact email address that they provide on their website or kind of what we call a cold contact, simply submitting your business plan or your business proposal to a venture fund because they get inundated of hundreds of those per month probably. So there has to be a little bit of a personal connection of a fund manager to a particular project. And I think this is important that at the beginning, when you start fundraising without having a big network in the venture capital industry, that you know a few people who have a network, who have a credibility. Once you have one investor convinced, then it's very likely that another investor from the network of that particular investor becomes interested as well. And this is how we actually got our first syndicate of venture capital investors together at ForRent-Abadie, providing the first seed financing, which were a couple of million Swiss francs. And this was the starting point. And from there, of course, things developed by itself, as I said, because then you are already in contact, in touch with professional investors, and they have their networks. They talk about your project, and then for a follow-on financing, it was a little bit easier to find additional investors. I think it's very important if you are a young postdoc, a young researcher who starts his or her own business, to have, a very established, well-known academic person with a lot of scientific credibility who helps you in your project and makes the first important contacts. So without this well-established co-founder that had a lot of credibility as being director of the Basel Institute for Immunology, it would have been much more difficult. So that opened a lot of doors. Two of the investors who later invested in my first company were actually, the investment managers were former co-fellow students of mine during PhD studies. So we knew each other for a couple of years already, but I had stayed in science. They had actually moved into the finance industry. That, of course, made it much easier. So from these contacts, of course, there was a spreading by word of mouth that other investors approached us and said, well, we heard that there's a project where you and the former director of the Basel Institute is a co-founder, and this is about antibody technology. We find this quite interesting. We did not send a fixed business plan to investors or approached investors almost in a very systematic way, reaching out to 50 professional venture capital companies, but rather that we entertained the personal contacts that we had. And from there, kind of the message spread. And then the companies were coming back to us and approaching us and said, well, we are interested in hearing more about what your plans are. And the plans were actually premature, so we developed them as the discussions went on. And it was really a process, I should say. So there was well, the idea to start a company on antibody technologies. There was a little bit of founders' money that was committed. Then, of course, when I could focus a little bit and develop the business plan or the operational plan, what we want to achieve, what kind of milestones, what kind of technology advancements, this doesn't go overnight. But quite honestly, I don't want to present my first business plan to any person anymore because it really is not exactly how it panned out at the end. But I think this is always what is happening with business plans. It is a plan. It is something that, you plan out as diligently as possible. But of course, reality always tells you later that you have to adapt. And I always say a business plan is a living document. You have to take opportunities when they come up in the development of the company. And then you have to change course and you have to adapt your strategies. Essentially, you have to rewrite your business plan probably every half year. Maybe not rewriting a business plan, but adapting your strategy accordingly to how things develop after you have started. This is something that investors always look for, that you have at least some skin in the game so that the co-founders put some real money and a commitment on the table so that it's evident that they believe in the project and are not simply waiting for others to pay for the project. So there has to be a little bit, skin in the game. This is what usually investors refer to. So that if the project fails, that you would also feel the pain in losing some of your hard-earned money. So I think this, of course, is something that investors are very much looking for, that you do an investment by yourself, especially in the early days. And we actually also, via the network of Professor Melchers, of course, had made investments ourselves. Professor Melchers was the biggest investor from the founder side at the beginning because he was financially, of course, the most secure person. We were just at the beginning of our academic careers, but he also brought another private investor in from his network that he knew before the venture capital investors came on board. This phase usually is called FFF funding, friends, fools, and family funding. I wouldn't call them fools, really. I think this is a little bit of an exaggeration. I think you always, have to be respectful that they also understand what kind of company they are investing in and what kind of project. So I think they were quite knowledgeable at the time, but of course they were not professional venture capital investors. They only came in a little bit later. Yeah, this is how it all started with the first company, and this was also not so different with the second company, I have to say. And it's also not so different from the third company that I'm currently setting up, that it usually always starts with money provided by the founders and some private investors who believe in the project, who believe in the people behind the project. And of course, if you have some co-founders in your project who have, a bigger network than yourself, then of course this is extremely helpful. You are invited to the offices of the venture capital companies. I mean, if you are at that point, you already have made an important step, because then they haven't sorted out your business plan or your proposal as something that they are not further interested in. They really spent time themselves, and usually with the whole team or most of the team members. You're invited to their offices, and then you present in a PowerPoint presentation your concept, your technology. Actually, what you are selling to the investors is very often a very immature concept and something where you don't have the data yet, because you need funds in order to create the data for the technology, the idea, or the concept that you want to realize or to commercialize. So this is why it's really called venture capital, or in German Risikokapital, because there's quite some risk, of course, involved. Each time you go to the investors, you get a lot of input and questions and feedback. And being scientists originally and coming from an academic environment, our presentations were very scientific, probably too scientific for most of the investors. So I can advertise that, if you start a company coming from university, be very critical to yourself and maybe pitch your story to some non-scientist to see whether they get the message. Because, I mean, if you're only used to pitch to other scientists, you have a lot of technical slides where you all of a sudden see that a lot of the investors lose the attention or they doze away. They want to know at the end, well, what is your business concept? How do you want to, well, provide a return on the investment in a reasonable time frame? And that is something we had to learn in the first pitches. And then also later on, as I mentioned, I mean, I did a little bit more business training where from people with a little bit of experience how to do fundraising. We also did some pitch training and how to actually have different sections in a pitch, in a presentation for investors. And that for sure has to have a couple of elements that are very important. And one is extremely important, and this is the team. Sometimes I've heard that venture capital investors look for three things that they want to invest in. One is the team, two is the team, and three is the team. It's maybe a little bit exaggerated, but I think the team is very critical. Probably more important than the project and value proposition that you're putting forward itself. Present the team members who, well, what their pedigree, their experience is, how it is complementary, what their function is in the company, how they are supporting the project. So the team is very important, because if you don't have the right team, the project can be brilliant and it still can become a failure. If you have a maybe mediocre project, a brilliant team can make this into a super successful project. So of course they're looking ideally for, well, this scientific excellence, technical excellence. They're looking that there's a little bit experience initially in business, but if that is not yet in the team, very often investors have their own people in the network. They are called entrepreneurs in residence, who have experience in running businesses, and they can often ask people from their network whether they would like to join this project in order to take over an operational part, either as a CEO or as a financial officer or an operation officer, so that there's some business expertise in the company from the beginning, especially in an early project, and sometimes tens of millions are required to bring the company into a certain value creating stage. For example, beginning of clinical trials, if you develop drugs. So that requires a lot of funding, and the investors would sometimes like to see that either in the founders team there's commercial expertise, and if the founders team doesn't provide that, they help in order to, well, find appropriate people, well, to complement the founders team to have an effective management and organization. The first seed financing round was about 2.5 million. And that was the basis to build the company, to build the structures, to build also the first labs and infrastructure that were required, and the operational organization with more scientists coming on board, and mostly technical people. And the next financing round, and that was in 2006, was straight away over 20 million. A classical Series A round. And that was the point where the lead investor suggested that there should be a new CEO coming in, because I was the startup CEO and I was also perfectly fine. As I mentioned at the beginning, my background was technical and scientific. So a very professional CEO came on board. But for various reasons, I mean, he left already 2 years later, and the responsibility was back to myself. But then we had a slightly larger organization, and I had a chief technical officer who was industry experienced, and a few more colleagues who joined along the way. And then we had already an organization that was about 40 people, in various functions in the company, so that the organization was quite effective. I think in total, over the lifetime of the company, and this was about 9 years, Roughly 40 million were invested in the company before it came to a trade sale. And in the final stages, again, a CEO was hired to help to position the company for an exit. And that indeed is a theme that you also find quite often, that someone with transaction expertise is brought in the last moment, which for the scientific founders sometimes is, well, some leap of faith that they have to provide also. But in my experience and opinion, it is actually a very good development that someone comes in with that experience, because that is not something that academic founders usually have as an experience, how to sell a company in the end, to organize a sale process with banks, with advisors, with legal counsels. It's a lot of legal and financial transaction knowledge that needs to be available. So it's good to have a team there with the technical expertise, but also the commercial expertise and the transaction expertise. This, I think, was the steepest learning curve for me as a scientist coming out of academia, to very quickly pick up the details of legal contracts, the, let's say, salient points of a legal contract, be it an investment agreement or a shareholders agreement, or at the end a purchase agreement for the company or the shares of the company. I think once one has done that once or twice, then of course it becomes almost an easy thing, because it's always around the same issues of liabilities. Of course, the price is important, but it's usually about liabilities, about the financial aspects, where you have to find common ground. You work with very experienced legal counsels at your side who have done that as well. And we always worked with excellent law firms here in Switzerland, in Basel, for these transactions. I think in biotech, where you need a lot of money in order to develop drugs or to develop a technology to a stage where you can really capitalize on the investment, I mean, usually you need tens of millions invested in a company. And there are hardly private investors around who spend so much money on a single project without having professional investors on their side. I mean, the first company we had Swiss, Dutch, and UK-based investors. So that was a syndicate of 4 venture capital investors who joined us along the journey until the exit happened in the first company. In the second company, we had 2 venture capital investors. So you usually have a syndicate of investors who, provide different angles also for, the time when it comes to a sale of the company, because they have had experience, ideally, with many exits or many share purchase agreements or trade sales. They have experience often also with initial public offerings. This is the business of the venture capital investors. They have their checklists of what they need to know about the company. They work them off. And this is actually the hard work that the lead investor puts in. And this is, therefore, the most important part of a syndicate of venture capital investors, to find a lead investor who commits his time and resource to do, in inverted commas, the dirty work of a due diligence, which simply means, checking all the documents, going into question and answer sessions with the teams, and investing a lot of time in, ensuring themselves that this is a proper value proposition, that concept works, and the company is really on a good track. And once you have that lead investor doing this work and giving a positive opinion, then of course other investors like to join if this is an investor that has a good reputation, because then all the due diligence work has been done properly and they can simply join the syndicate and piggyback on the investment. Well, it's essential. I think without the VC investors, the professional investors, you will it will be very difficult to bring a company to a value inflection point that you can return 50 or 100 million investment into a company. You hardly ever actively turn down an investor. You always try to accommodate them if, of course, there's a fit and you have the feeling this is good for the company and the investor profile fits to the project. And then, of course, you always try to engage as many as possible. And if it doesn't fit for a particular financing round, maybe then it's a fit for the next financing round. And by this, you extend your network. And once you have done this for the first company, well, for the next company, maybe there are investors who you didn't work with in the first company who then join the syndicate in the second company. Yeah. And this was indeed something that happened to me, that one of the investors who wasn't part of the first company became then part of the second company. You will not get an investor who invests in medtech when you develop drugs. It just doesn't. It's not a fit. So of course you make your own diligence or due diligence on the investors who could be a fit. It could also be not only the type of the project. It could also be the stage of funding. So if you are a very early stage company and you're looking to raise seed financing of 2 million and you approach a fund that has 3 billion under management, they will not look at you because they cannot invest 2 million because then they would have thousands of investments that they cannot manage. So they would only come into your company when you are at the stage where you need 50 million or 100 million to come to the next stage. So this is something that often you do not know offhand. Of course, you ask in your network, well, what are the investors that could be a fit for my project? Because it's not only that the investors talk about amongst each others, it's also the founders and the companies talk amongst each others. And you can spend tons of time with a particular fund. If it's not the right match in terms of project scope or timing for the investment or size of the investment, then it's a futile exercise. I think it's good to have investors who not only give you the money, but also expertise, who have experience in the team, who have experience in the field, who have network in the industry, because they will help you in your project by making connections, by coming up with ideas, and providing input to your project. So we call them value-add investors, who not only add money or provide you with financial firepower, but also provide you with guidance and feedback and ideas that make sense in the context of the project. You have to focus on the project and the, let's say, business concept that is most likely to be successful. So the investors very often remind the founders to focus. They always say focus, focus, focus. But of course, the investors should not take too much influence on, let's say, entrepreneurial decisions. So I think there has to be this operational freedom. And this is why the team is so important, where the investors invest in, because at the end, they entrust the team to make the decisions. Of course, you have to report back to the investors or the board of directors, and usually the investors are represented in the board of directors of a company. So you have to report back to them regularly. What is your strategy? Where do you want to go? What are the achievements? What are the challenges? So the compromise, what you have to give up is that you only follow your own vision and idea. So of course you consider the advice of the investors, because they are part of the team. And it's important that you consider them as being part in your team, and that you, like in a boat, row into the same direction. If everyone goes into the different direction, you will not get forward. What you have to give up is that, you have to find compromises. I think you cannot simply ignore advice of the investors. So you have to take this into consideration. But not all ideas and suggestions of investors make sense. Likewise, not all suggestions, ideas of the founders or management team make sense. I think it's good to have an open communication about, and in the boards, in the supervisory boards of the company, of what the team is concerned with, what they propose. Yeah, you're not only transparent and open with your team members, but also, of course, with the investors, who I always consider being part of the team, so that you can always find the best solution for a particular challenge. And there are always challenges, as I mentioned earlier, in building a company, and obstacles where you need to find creative solutions. So I think it's very important, that everyone is well informed transparently, and that when you have board meetings, essentially all the issues are already known, and people could get their heads around it even before a board meeting. They put a lot of money on the table or at stake for their investments. So they would like to know first when there are challenges ahead, or if a strategy needs to be changed, or if a certain technology or certain development didn't work out as hoped for or as advertised. This, of course, can happen, and then you need to find solutions for this. And therefore, you have to be, you want to inform them as quickly as possible. On the other hand, one also has to be a little bit careful to inform them in a way that you have all the data around, and that you're not kind of, having a situation that you communicate something so early that you haven't actually come up with a right conclusion yourself, or with, a complete data analysis, because then it can come very quickly to false conclusions and to maybe some panic reactions if you say, well, this hasn't worked. But in fact, the data has not been completely analyzed. In large pharma companies, I've heard that sometimes, certain developments in data are embargoed, not to be communicated to kind of upper line managers. And they're in a startup environment where you're much closer together and discussing things very quickly. You have to find the right balance to basically not, when you get the printout from your device and it's unexpected, to immediately communicate this to the investors or the board, but rather take the time in analyzing the data, involving also the, let's say, the scientific advisory board in the evaluation of something that might be critical, to get the experts' advice, and then kind of have, first of all, the issue outlined, but then also potentially solutions already that you communicate, because if you only present a problem without the solution, that's very dangerous ground. My advice is sometimes to not force a solution or a decision on a given day or point of time, but basically say, if you needed to ventilate this, let us think about this, and let's park a decision until we have slept about it, maybe another night or 2 nights, and let's get back together when things have calmed down a little bit and the dust has settled. Simply, it's not a solution to say, well, this is not possible, we cannot go forward. I think this is the recipe for disaster if people simply are not willing to find a compromise and do not find a compromise, because if that happens, then people will pull the plug and basically say, well, then we rather don't do anything and we let the whole thing explode. And this is not good for anyone. So you have to find a solution. And there's always a solution. I think I mentioned that before. I think if there's a challenge, there's always a solution. You just have to find it. And I think this is the art of, a successful CEO, to find the right compromise. Because investors, they, after especially 2 or 3 financing rounds, of course, they've put so much money in that they usually are also in the position, to separate from management personnel or to let them go. So one has to see what are the powers in the company. So that's the learning. Don't basically stomp on the ground and basically say, well, this is it and I'm not moving. Everyone is willing to move to a certain point. You cannot always go according to your own wish or will. Of course, there are characters around, but they are usually on a hot seat. So I think it's better to find a compromise.